Villains are the best. Not just cool, but tall and with great hair and come-to-bed teeth. Obviously, I'm a very big fan of the bad guys, the villains, the black hats. We're just better in a deeply sexual way. Now, we live in an odd time for villains. The top ne'er-do-wells in WWE, for example, Kevin Owens, Y2J, AJ Styles. Those guys are often cheered over the designated baby faces. We're in the era of the cool heels, the guys that fans love to hate. But what makes someone truly villainous is to be the guy that fans hate to hate, who get your blood boiling and have grannies around the world filling their handbags with stones to give them a proper good crack. Honourable mention as ever goes to my dad. Love you, Eric. I'm Adam from WhatCulture.com, and here are the 10 greatest wrestling villains. Number 10, Ted DiBiase. Everyone's got a price. Mine is $6.99 a month and all the dislikes in the world. The $1 Million Man was a brilliant villain, operating on the very simple principle that people hate the guy who has more money with them and isn't afraid to let them know about it. Also, he literally cackled all the time, which is like Bad Guy 101 or 1,000,001 is what I'm getting at. DiBiase would often do terrible things like stuff money in the mouths of his fallen foes, have a mullet and a beard, but the absolute height of villainy was getting a little boy up in front of millions of people watching at home on an episode of Superstars and offer him $500 to bounce a basketball 15 times. The boy's doing well right up until bounce number 14 when Teddy kicks the basketball away. He then says directly into the face of a confused and upset child, "If you don't do the job right, you don't get paid." That is villainous perfection. Number 9, Bobby Heenan, the weasel, the brain, the man. When you ask people who is the greatest manager of all time, some may say Paul Heyman, and he was so close to getting on this list you won't believe it. But if you're a wrestling fan of a certain age, you will respond, Bobby Heenan. As part of the Heenan family, he's managed some of the best bad guys in the history of wrestling. Andre the Giant, Adrian Adonis, Rick Rude, Mr. Perfect, Ric Flair, also the Red Rooster, but we all have off days. What makes Heenan so great is not just his wit, he was probably the best guy in the history of the business for rattling off insults, better than even Jerry Lawler, but what makes him truly beloved is his total lack of shame. This is a guy that was locked out of the building on the first ever episode of Raw and dressed up like an old lady and a rabbi to try and sneak his way in. This is a guy that was forcibly dressed in a weasel costume on TV and pulled it off. Yet despite every time they humiliated him, he was so great that he also retained some form of slimeball dignity. He was a true master of annoyance. Number 8, Roddy Piper. Is They Live the best movie starring a wrestler? No, that's Bending the Rules starring Edge and Jamie Kennedy. Justice has one small problem. Them. Hot Rod was an exceptional villain, with that incredibly rare ability to be hilariously cruel, but never truly likable. As a fan, you knew that he was blisteringly good at his job, but that never translated into full-blown cheers. He was just too nasty, whether it be cracking that infamous coconut over the head of Jimmy Snuka, or, and this is one of the most effective heel moves of all time, kicking Cyndi Lauper. Seriously, with that last one, the country went mental. It's a very famous segment as part of the Rock and Wrestling connection, which is what led to WrestleMania being such a huge success. In Madison Square Garden, pop sensation Cyndi Lauper presented a framed gold record to Captain Lou Albano. Piper then smashed it over his head. Shocked, Lauper rushed to Albano's aid and was kicked off him by Piper. I mean, it was more of a push with the foot than a kick, but still, with that dastardly act, Piper became one of the most hated men in wrestling at the time. Number 7, Triple H. The King of Kings is like an onion of heat. It's difficult to tell if the crowd hate his character, him as a person, whether they enjoy booing him or they just want him to go away, if they think he's good at his job, bad at it. It's confusing, but there can be little doubt that over the years, Triple H was one of the most comically evil men in the history of time. In his storied career, he has organized Steve Austin being attempted murdered via fat man-driven car. He's drugged and married a woman against her consent. He's had sex with a mannequin in a coffin, tried to break HBK's back with a hammer, organized a gang assault on a mentally disabled man. He tied up and nearly killed William Regal in a hotel room. That is just stupid levels of evil. Couple that with a genuine fan resentment that Triple H spent so many years politicking to keep his place at the top of the card, you've got a man who spent lots of his adult life swimming in the hatred of others. Number 6, Ric Flair. The Nature Boy Ric Flair was the kind of heel that kept the wrestling business going. Pretty much throughout the entire 1980s, Ric Flair was the NWA World Heavyweight Champion. I mean, sure, a handful of others may have had brief runs with the belt, Dusty Rhodes, Harley Race, but sooner rather than later, it always came back to Flair. Why? Because Flair was the man that everyone wanted to pay money to see get his ass kicked. He had the beautiful villainous combination of being technically good enough in the ring to not be written off as a paper champion, but took so many shortcuts that everyone loathed him. Whichever territory he went to in the NWA, he made the local babyface challenging for his title look like $1 million, tossing him all around the ring. And when he'd barely escaped with the gold in a screwy finish, then whenever he'd come back, the crowd would pay hand over fist to see someone else slap his platinum blonde hair around. In the 1980s, the NWA was powered by pure Flair villainy. Number 5, superstar Billy Graham. Of course, if you talk about Ric Flair being one of the greatest villains of all time, then you have to mention the man who inspired him. The man of the hour, the man with the power, too sweet to be sour. Superstar Billy Graham was a pioneer of pure in the 1970s. He took charisma and flamboyance to previously unseen levels with tie-dye ring gear, platinum blonde hair, earrings, that physique, and his feather boas. In a slightly drier era of wrestling, he was a shot of adrenaline, and his exceptional mic skills drew crowds in their thousands, even though most of what he was saying was chatting about them. Hulk Hogan, Jesse Ventura, Ric Flair have all held up Graham as the epitome of the blonde cocksure villain, and who are we to argue? Number 4, Chris Jericho. Most of the superstars on this list excelled at their villainous gimmick. What makes Chris Jericho one of the greatest villains of all time is that he's excelled at like 12. Y2J is the best example of a man who is not content with resting on his laurels, despite those laurels being so comfy. He is a shapeshifter, reinventing himself so many times over his long career. He was a doofus, obnoxious villain in WCW, an insecure creep with that awful beard, an unsettling psychopath against HBK, a silent weirdo when he returned in 2012, and the Jericho we have now, a sort of snooty French waiter magician with a list and a scarf and an ever-expanding roster of catchphrases. He's just the latest incarnation, constantly changing, constantly funny. Jericho is at his absolute best as a heel, and the sheer amount of creativity he puts into each and every persona guarantees his spot on this list. Number 3, Freddie Blassie. At one point in time, classy Freddie Blassie was the most hated wrestler on the face of the earth. And that was in the 50s and 60s when kayfabe lived and heels were properly hated. Some wrestlers had their cars keyed, others were assaulted in the street. Yeah, Blassie was so despised that he had acid thrown at him by a fan. That is deep heat. He was apparently stabbed over 20 times by fans during his career, good work Freddie, but in Japan he became a villainous phenomenon. He was the vampire. He would file his teeth to be sharp and bite his opponent's head and necks, drawing blood. He claimed that Japanese fans would have heart attacks watching his matches. He actually said, "In my whole career, 92 people dropped dead of heart attacks. My ambition was to kill 100, and I failed." Villain. Number 2, the NWO. I was tempted to put Hollywood Hogan on this list, with his heel turn being one of the most shocking things to happen in wrestling, not just in the 90s. But really, in terms of the effect on the wrestling industry, both very good and very bad, the real villain is the NWO as an idea. Looking back, Hogan was an enjoyable bad guy, but fairly lame in terms of performance, whereas the NWO as a stable, as a concept, was all-powerful, all-consuming, all destructive. Its villainy knew no bounds, sweeping through WCW like a poison, like a dose of black ink in the milk. In the mid-90s, when colourful wrestling had been at its most stagnant, the black and white rejuvenated it, making WCW insane amounts of money. Of course, in a double dose of villainy, the NWO got way out of control, completely dominated the WCW locker room, eventually becoming a bloated, confusing mess that served to drive viewers away in their droves. Good or bad, there's no arguing that during the most significant time in wrestling, few villains were as significant as the NWO. Well, maybe one was. And number 1, Mr. McMahon. I mean, how is it not Vince? How could it not be the god-fighting, wife-drugging, diva-kissing, chicken-walking, kiss-my-ass-club founding #1 lunatic in the history of wrestling? The genetic jackhammer, the chairman of the board, or as JR would say, Satan himself. Not only has Vince McMahon been a cartoon Disney villain for the past decade, but like the NWO before him, his villainy was a turning point in his company's fortunes. After the formation of the NWO, WCW began a campaign of TV ratings domination of the WWF that lasted for 84 straight weeks. But what was it that finally broke that streak? That was an advertised match on Raw, Stone Cold Steve Austin versus Vince McMahon. That put WWF over the top in the ratings, and since then, they never really looked back. When Vince McMahon inadvertently turned himself into the biggest villain in wrestling after the Montreal Screwjob, he found the role he'd been born to play and became one half of a long-running feud that made his company absolute millions. And that's our list. Did we miss any out? Tell us about it in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter here. I'm Adam from WhatCulture.com, and I'll see you soon.